Software Engineering Radio, Episode 23, Architecture Part 1. Okay, welcome to this new episode of Software Engineering Radio. This one is the first episode on software architecture, and it's something we tried for the first time. This is basically a Skype teleconference with 3 people. So this is me, Markus. Then we have Alex.
Hi.
And Michael.
Hello there.
Okay, so software architecture. This is a very big topic, and we'll need several episodes to cover it. In this first episode, we'll talk about the fundamentals. This includes the role of the software architect and what software architecture is after all. To get the discussion started, let's come up with a definition of what software architecture is, and then let's see whether the 3 of us agree on that. So in the American Heritage Dictionary, I found a definition about what is architecture, and it says, the art and science of designing and erecting buildings, a style and method of designing construction, and the orderly management of parts. So if we transfer that to software architecture, we would say that software architecture basically is the art and science of designing and building software, a style and method of design and construction, as well as the orderly management or arrangement of parts. Anybody disagrees?
No, I think essentially it covers the core of it. When I get asked in my consulting activities to define what architecture is, then I mostly refer to first responsibilities, functionalities that my system has to fulfill. Secondly, to interactions, to dependencies between those responsibilities, and thirdly, to interfaces between those responsibilities due to the dependencies, due to the interactions. And that is basically all I need for doing architecture. And the hard problem with doing architecture is to fulfill all the forces, all basically the non-functional concerns, non-functional requirements that are implied on my system. And as an architect, I try to balance those.
Right, so architecture is always a compromise. Alex, I think you want to say something about software architecture versus the other kinds of architecture that are necessary when building systems.
Exactly. One point, architect or software architect is a heavily used term right now. So almost everybody calls himself an architect. But what we really discuss here is software architecture and software architects. There are many other architects out there. There are IT architects, business architects, integration, enterprise architects, and every architect does another thing. He has another responsibility, actually.
Can you give one example of such another responsibility?
Let's begin with an IT architect, for example. The IT architect usually is responsible for infrastructure, for hardware, for network topologies, and therefore for the infrastructure stuff. An enterprise architecture is the overall architect who keeps all the things working together, the software architecture, the IT architecture, business architecture, and so on. An enterprise software architect, on the other hand, is a software architect that does huge software systems, enterprise-ready software systems. So these architects have very, very different roles in an enterprise or in a company, and very often these get mixed up, so we have to clearly discuss what a software architect is here in our podcasts, I guess.
Right, so in this podcast we cover software architecture. We do not look at the other kinds of architectures. We might cover them in later episodes.
Yeah.
Before we go on, can I maybe offer another definition of what architecture is, or what software architecture is, and that would be everything that I care about in a project that should be standardized or done in a similar fashion. Would you say that this is a sensible definition of architecture?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, that is part of the result, the role of an architect, that you have to ensure consistency, and with software architecture at a high level, you ensure this consistency.
What I like about this kind of definition is, for me, architecture actually is a pretty fuzzy, a conceptual thing. I mean, we have code, and architecture is within the code, but it's not something explicit. We don't have an explicit or divided architecture thing. It's just it's like a structural thing or whatever.
So maybe this also leads us to the distinction between design and architecture.
Exactly.
So if I say that architecture is everything that I care about that should be standardized and consistent, then design is maybe everything on a granularity level below that.
Right, exactly. That I totally agree with that. Design for me is one level below architecture, and wherever you start with your architecture, design is below it. So architecture is for me as at the top level, guiding the project, guiding the system, guiding the software under development with rules, with design guidelines, with design principles to adhere to, with architectural styles and architectural patterns that guide, that shape the overall software system. At the lower layer, you would then have the design where you talk about individual classes, where you talk about objects, variables, and all those things.
But is there actually some kind of border? Where does design end and architecture begin, or other way around?
Yeah, that's maybe the trick of this definition I offered, because if I say I don't care whether somebody implements something using the observer pattern or in another way, then it's design, because it's on a level that's not critical for example, the non-functional requirements for my system. It's not important that it's done in a standardized way. If I want it to be done in a specific way to realize certain requirements, then I say it's architecture.
Yeah,
so it's kind of a self-fulfilling definition.
And this contradicts a bit the granularity thing. I mean, it's more the importance, you say, is
right.
the indicator if it's design or architecture.
So you say in some cases you might have to make architectural decisions that are quite fine granular, quite low level.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm. So let's briefly touch upon some process issues. In the agile world, the term architect and architecture is somewhat disliked. People say agile projects don't need an architecture or don't need an architect. Any opinions on that?
I don't think they say in an agile project you don't have an architecture. All the systems I've seen that are done with extreme programming, for example, have an architecture, and mostly a very, very good architecture. So they have a structure, they have an architecture, they have important design decisions, to stay with your definition. What they not so often have is an explicit architect as a role. So I guess there is the huge difference between the traditional software development projects or methods and agile projects.
Yeah, I would put it that way, that in agile projects the architecture is not explicitly planned, but much more created by having always a running system, starting with a small core, starting with the areas of highest risk, and then defining the architecture implicitly while developing the working system. And the architecture grows as you complete your system. And still, I believe it's important to pick the right architectural patterns for this core, for the initial working system, to then be able to grow that system and not having to refactor your whole solution to match the later requirements when you increase, when you grow your system.
Exactly, that's a very important point there. The timing is different from traditional software projects or methods. They usually do all the architecture stuff in front of the project, front up, and agile projects try to avoid design and architectural decisions as long as possible. They try to decide at the latest responsible moment in the project. So it feels different, but there still is architecture and architectural work, of course.
So there is maybe a difference between the architecture as an artifact that you might want to create at the beginning of a project, which consists of paper basically and UML diagrams or whatever, and then the architecture as something that you can extract from an existing system, so something that grows over time. And the agile folks say we don't want to do this upfront thing, but rather make sure the architecture evolves over time.
Exactly. And this is one of the similarities between these different architect types or type of architects we talked before. Usually, if you have an architect, you have to distinguish between the actual architecture, the architecture of the software system, and views of the architecture. And maybe you do the views front up and do the design and the architecture front up and do UML diagrams or whatever. But you also can do it later on the project or even after the project as a post-mortem. So the views of the architecture, and there are many views, there are static views, dynamic views, whatever, are not the architecture itself.
But if I want to come up with a consistent system, and also if I say I don't want to pre-plan the architecture, rather I want to evolve it over time or over the course of the project, if I want it to be consistent, how do I make sure that in such an agile approach a consistent system evolves then?
I think having guidelines and having as few as possible principles that are accepted by all developers involved can help with that. So, for example, only asynchronous communication is involved in the whole system, and no synchronous communication, because you need to be highly reactive and you're in embedded real-time environment. So if you just prohibit the use of synchronous communication, that already saves you a lot of trouble, and many design decisions can be derived from that principle.
So you say that you also have a number of guiding principles even in those agile projects, but you don't spend, 2 months and write this big architecture document up front.
Yes, that's the point.
Okay.
And another thing is you usually try to keep your code and therefore your architecture, but mostly your code, in a state where you can change it easily. And the easier it is to change the code, or for example the don't repeat yourself thing. If you have to just change little parts of the systems to do actual architectural changes, it's easier for you to change the architecture. And to be honest, even if in the non-agile projects I were in, we had to change some architectural stuff later on. So architecture can't be really static. It shouldn't be, in my opinion, actually. So you should do everything to make it flexible and changeable and so on.
So it's basically not possible to come up with an architecture up front. You might be able to start, start with a good starting point by using architectural patterns or something, which we'll talk about in later episodes. But it always has to evolve.
Yeah. It's a bit different in product lines or something like that, where you just can copy an architecture that already is proven in this area. But in normal, non-complex systems, you can't come up with an architecture front up that really hits the point and doesn't have to be changed on the way.
So, Michael, do we need an architect?
Yes, I agree. I think the role of an architect is often overvalued and maybe misunderstood. So it almost seems like it's the most honor of a developer to become an architect.
I want to have this said on my business card.
Right, and so I think every developer is as valuable as an architect. I actually kind of dislike this ownership, but still I think somebody in the team must be responsible to ensure consistency, to facilitate communication, to ensure reuse, and to coach others in a project. And if I would have to give this person a name, it's of course the architect. Yes.
There is always this discussion whether there should be one architect or whether there should be a group of people who do the architecture, and that's maybe somewhat. There's maybe an analogy that people say that there's this saying that says nice systems or well-designed systems are the product of a simple, brilliant mind or something like that. You might have heard about this statement. So do we need to have one architect who makes sure that everything is consistent in a way that he thinks, or do we have a group of architects, or how does this work? Or can this be done in different ways in different projects?
I think for small teams, one person, one architect is totally sufficient. But for big projects and projects distributed over several locations, which is the common case in my company that I work for, you have typically a group of architects. And the important point here is to have only one lead architect. So it's kind of a hierarchical system that I suggest. So, for example, for every subsystem, have an architect, or, well, not for every subsystem, but try to minimize the number of architects. But when distributing the architects, associate with them individual subsystems, and then have one lead architect that has the final saying when there's dispute, when there is disagreement on design decisions.
And also it might probably make sense to, in big systems, to have architects that are experts in certain technologies. Like, for example, if you use Corba, then you might want to have somebody who you might want to call Corba architect or middleware architect or something who deals with the technology specifics.
Right, and also, well, what I just said, splitting according to subsystems, splitting according to layers is also something that is very common.
Right. Okay, to summarize what we discussed so far, why does a system need a software architecture? So first of all, it resolves conflicting forces in a specific way. A software architecture, as we said before, is almost always a compromise. It also serves as a guideline for more detailed design decisions. So the design decisions that developers or teams make on their own have to be compatible or in line with the architecture. So that helps to create a consistent software system. As a consequence, the architecture also leads to a well-defined programming model. Programming model is a term that we'll discuss later, I guess, and it basically means that if you want to implement business logic based on a certain architectural style or on a certain architecture, then the programming model defines how you implement that business logic. The architecture can also serve as a basis for a software system family, which is also something we discuss later in the context of product line engineering. A software architecture also helps to define the basic building blocks, metaphors for the system, or even the vocabulary that can be used to discuss about the system in the team. So, before we go on, two additional observations, I think it's important that in a team, the architecture is something that everybody feels responsible for. It doesn't make too much sense if you have this guru architect who, always makes sure the documents are nice, but nobody cares about that. And also, usually, an architecture, as we said, has to be built incrementally. It evolves over time. Over time, during a project, though, the number of changes and the severity of changes should become less frequent. Otherwise, your initial software architecture was probably wrong. And the experience of a software architect shows basically experienced software architects more often get it right or relatively right in the beginning. So that's basically a summary of what we discussed till now. We should probably now discuss in a bit more detail the tasks that a software architect has to execute, the things that he's responsible for in a software project. So we go from software architecture as the thing we build to the tasks of architecting a system, to the responsibility of the software architect.
So as I just introduced, when I talk about software architects, I always think about bigger projects, or projects that have a size of at least 15 to 20 developers. And so here is already a problem that I see, that is the scalability of the role. I mean, can a single person do all the design decision? Should a single person do all the design architecture decision? Or should much more the team collaborate and define the architecture commonly? And should basically one person then ensure the consistency of it? So this has also to do with scalability, having teams at a size of like 50 developers or even 100 developers working on a software project. You need a way to scale the role of an architect. And so to achieve the scalability, I generally define the priorities of an architect like that. So first, he has to communicate with the stakeholders. So this is product management, general management. This is with the requirements folks, with the customers if necessary, and of course between the teams, with the developers. And what he should share are the requirements, the design guidelines, the principles that the whole development team should adhere to. Secondly, with the second priority, he should ensure the consistency of the overall architecture by reviewing the design made by the individual developers. So this is, for me, this is a key here because, well, when I'm in a team, I trust the developers that they do good design decisions, having the basic principles at hand. And doing regular reviews ensures that all the design decisions go along and smooth and towards the same goal to achieve the product success.
Right, so reviews is not a sign of mistrust. It's rather just a way to make sure that people have compatible decisions, right?
Yes.
Okay.
And the third priority is guiding the developers in doing good design. There might be some team members that are not so experienced, and coaching them, doing design commonly with them, being on the whiteboard and discussing things is very valuable for them. And you also then get a good feeling for how the developers think about the design, how the design decisions got defined, how they got worked out. And only with the least priority you would contribute your own design knowledge, because the main flow of your experience into the project should come through the reviews. And so with this, I had already good success in the past and was able to lead even big projects as a technical lead, as an architect.
It's probably a tough one for those guru architects who always want to show that they're the best technical geeks and the best experts on something, if you say that they should contribute their knowledge only on priority 4.
Yeah, it might be kind of disappointing to them, but I believe the amount of developers, the amount of brain working there is much larger this way than having only one guru architect.
For me, the best way to scale architects in a project were actually, if you have more than one architect, of course you should have this lead architect we already talked about, but then the single architect should concentrate on different architectural components or layers or whatever. So you should give an architect a responsibility for an architectural thing, whatever this thing means. This is better for identification with the topic, and I made the best, or got the best results with this kind of scaling there.
So one thing where it's probably a good idea to have separate architects or people or technical leads is for certain technologies. I think we agree on that.
Yeah. But in my opinion, you shouldn't have just a core architect that doesn't know anything about the rest of the application.
Right, obviously.
So you should actually integrate the discussion or the people along architectural things, whatever this means, as said, components or whatever. So yes, you need architects with different skill sets, but they shouldn't be really separated along these technical topics. I actually worked on projects where we just had this database architect and then this middleware architect, and this was actually also the organizational thing that the one just cared for the database and the other didn't know anything about the database, and that was a huge communication problem, and it never really fit together. So I'm not so sure if this is a good way to organize the architects, but of course you should have people with different special skill sets.
Yeah, I also know a consulting company in Germany that splits the roles of architects along infrastructure architects and application architects. So the infrastructure architects would care about all the middleware communication, database persistency, etc. And the application architects would then actually deal with the customer requirements, with implementing the application logic on top of that. And I always ask myself whether that is a good split, whether they, for example, the infrastructure architects have the right understanding of the problem to make the right design decisions, to whether they know all the forces imposed on the software system as a whole.
That's exactly the point. If these both architects don't have to know or understand what the other does for their job, and the architectural things are that separated that it works, it can work. If the middleware architect actually doesn't have to know anything about the other things in the system and the business logic or whatever,
which
is
unlikely.
Could work. But this is very, very unlikely, and then I have had a lot of trouble with these kinds of separation.
So I think we agree that it's not a good idea to have the technical geeks do their own thing and don't care about the rest. And that's probably true for most systems. I think there is an exception, and that is something we'll discuss in further episodes, and that is in the context of product lines or software system families, where you explicitly want to build and evolve a platform that can basically carry many different applications. There you usually have a domain architect, a person who takes care of the fundamentals of the product line, and then you have for each project that you build on top of the product line, you have application architects.
But actually, even there, I would always try to get someone into these, however you call it, infrastructural architectures things, who knows the domain stuff.
Yes,
so
absolutely. You do need domain architects, but they are different from the specific application architects.
Yeah, and here the difference is also domain architects doesn't mean infrastructure architects. Infrastructure, it's not only technical, the domain, what the platform they use, but it's a domain-specific platform. So it is not only about communication and databases. It is also about, for example, the e-commerce domain, about the automotive domain. There are specifics, there are customer requirements that get down to the domain engineering, to the platform, and have an impact there.
Okay, exactly. But we'll discuss this topic in subsequent episodes, right? Another thing that I want to distinguish is the roles of the architect versus the role of the technical project lead. Is this the same person, or do you see any difference there?
Yeah, sometimes it's explicitly defined like that, at least in my environment, and in other cases the lead architect of a project is then de facto basically the technical project lead, being asked for all the tough technical questions in a project.
So, but this is also a scalability thing. I mean, if you have a project with 10 developers, you don't, at least in my opinion, you don't need a technical project lead, an architect, or more than one architect. And so, of course, the thing is completely different if you have a project with 200 developers.
Yeah,
so,
I mean, go ahead.
Yeah, no, pause.
Okay. Scaling an I mean, I think it's obvious that a 3-person project can't be done the same way as a 200-person project, and we'll probably discuss that in subsequent episodes. So, is the architect also does he have to deal with politics and all that?
For sure.
Stuff.
For sure. I mean, an architect has, or one of the major points an architect has to do is communicate with the developers, communicate with the project manager, and even the customer. If you have some functional stuff that affects the architecture, sometimes it's better to change the requirements a bit to get a much better architecture and therefore speed. And even the customer does want this change in requirements. So politics, communication is maybe at least as important as technical knowledge to me for an architect.
For me, the technical project lead or software architect is the one who should be most concerned about the technical soundness and the proper technical goals, and he should preferably stay out of politics. And when he gets into politics, he should vote for the system, care for the technology, care for the sound architectural decisions, and try to minimize all, of course, personal interests.
So you say that the technical architect, the architect should say, from a non-political point of view, this is the way we should go, and if you managers want to override this decision because you think there is some political stuff we have to do, then it's your decision, it's your responsibility, but I, as a technical person, I'll say, do it this way.
I would prefer that way. I know that it's a tough way, but that is the way I went in the past. I had a lot of trouble with this way, but at the end, I had always a clean mind at least, and
right. That's the point. I always do it this. I try to do it the same way, and if I'm involved with too much politics, I'll leave the project. Being a freelance consultant, I can do that.
Maybe not the best solution for the project.
No, but it really depends. I mean, a frustrated Markus on a project is also not something you want to have.
Might be worse. Yes, you're right.
Leaving a project just makes a point. I mean, this tells the project, don't go on like that.
But you just mentioned the politics to the direction customer or management or whatever. I don't think that is the only kind of politics you have to deal with as an architect, because you also have developers and UI designers and requirement engineers, whatever. You have to deal with maybe a huge team, and every larger group of people has politics within. So I still think an architect should have the sense for politics and human interactions and communications.
Yeah, but is that the same? I mean, I agree that an architect should be able to work with people and coach people and communicate people, and maybe also resolve, if members of the team get on top of each other and fight some stuff out, that the architect should be able to resolve that. But I mean, that's not what I would call politics. That
depends on your definition of politics, of course. For me, it is politics too, but that's a definition thing.
For me, that would be management of a team. And politics is really, this stuff that you go to the customer and basically tell him crap so you get the money.
I said that's a definition thing. I mean,
of course,
I think we agree on this human interaction thing. We have to deal a lot with people as an architect, even more than with technology, in my opinion. And you have to have the skills. I mean, that's one of the points why I think the best programmer might be a not so good architect. Because you have to have more abilities than just architecture or technical stuff. It doesn't work if you have the best architecture in mind and can't communicate it to your team or get the team to implement it.
Too big of an ego, and therefore always is right.
Exactly. All these social skills set things are very, very important for architects, in my opinion.
Okay, until now we've been talking about what the architect does once the project or the implementation has started. Is there stuff for the architect to do before the project really starts, like in the areas of requirements or estimating the amount of money it costs or assembling the team, maybe hiring people? So any things the architect should do in these phases?
Yeah, in my belief and in my understanding, the architect should be involved as early as possible. And the architect should question the requirements very much. So when the architect doesn't understand or doesn't have the feeling that there are sufficient requirements available, he won't be able to communicate the design or design goals or generally the requirements to the development team. So in any case, when, for example, a system gets developed and the project starts with no requirements, only weak requirements, I would actually expect the architect to do the requirements engineering, to talk to the customer, to talk to management, to all the stakeholders, and get the requirements straight.
I agree, although that's something that many architects, especially the more technical minds, don't really like to do. And that's also where I might want to throw in a small anecdote about the role of the architect and politics. When I was working for a big consulting company a while ago, we had to do an estimation for a project, and we came up with, 20 million or something. And so it was a rather big number, and then there was management and said, that's too expensive. We have to have at most 12 million. So please reduce your estimations. So of course we didn't, and then of course that was where politics came in. We offered the project with about 12 million, and the customer accepted, and then of course we had roughly 8 million overrun.
Isn't there a term for that? Design to cost or something like that?
Yes.
But you didn't design to cost, actually. You just...
we just skipped.
Yeah.
Anyway, just an anecdote. Is the architect also responsible for building the team? What do you do as an architect if you see the team isn't appropriate, or there are folks in the team who aren't up to the challenge?
No, don't ask those tough questions.
I know that I shouldn't, but I think this is really a tough one, because if you as the architect see that one of the problems in a project is that you have some people who aren't up to the job, what do you do? I mean,
but that's highly dependent on the project and the organization you work in.
So what's the alternatives?
Well, of course, you could just talk to the guy you have the problem with. Maybe you can coach him, whatever. Otherwise, and most probably you already did this at this point, so it didn't work. You can talk to the project manager about the decision of staffing, if it's possible to exchange him, whatever. I mean, the organization, maybe even the project manager has not the right to exchange people there. So,
should this be possible for an architect to exchange people if necessary?
No, not in my opinion.
No, I agree with that. He shouldn't have the right to do it. So it should be the problem. It should be the responsibility of the project manager, the project lead. But I mean, the architect is the one who can best judge the technical abilities, the technical fitting, whether a person is in the right position in a project. And when he has a gut feeling that this doesn't work, he should talk to the project manager and try to find a position within the project that this person, this developer, could fulfill best his or her job.
That leads to this organization where you have 2 or 3 people who do the real work, then you have another 2 or 3 people who help those people to do the real work, and then you have this other set of people who do something so that they have something to do.
No, it doesn't have to be that.
Obviously, it's a bit provoking.
Yeah, but and it doesn't have to be that way. I mean, there are things that are important and just require different skill set. I mean, talking to customers, doing maintenance, doing UI design, for example, is a very important thing. And I know a lot of developers, great technical guys, who have a lot of trouble with doing good UI design. So at least in the larger projects or project teams, you really often have work to do that is important, and you just have to find the right person for it. So I wouldn't be so negative on this point.
Okay, I mean, I don't fire people all the time. It's just I wanted to provoke the discussion.
No, of course, and sometimes you have to. I mean, it's clear not everybody is okay for a software project and can do it. So sometimes you have to, of course.
Yeah, I mean, especially in highly critical and projects with a very tough timeline, you have very little time to argue whether this person is right in this position or not. And here it's a really problematic and ethical question how to deal with that. Yeah.
But still, I think it's not the question an architect should answer. An architect should give an indication if somebody is not good in his job, and maybe, or he should also give a hint where he could do a good job, but he shouldn't do all this decision stuff. I mean, an architect has to have some relationship with the developers, and if he just throws out people out of the team, it's much harder to work in a team together.
Yeah. Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, you need to have trust as an architect. The developers need to trust you. You need to be able to trust the developers to be a good team. Else it doesn't work, and you're no longer an architect, because the architect, well, defines itself by the team, by the developers. And when you're not accepted, you're just not the architect, even though you might call yourself being the architect.
Okay, so I think this basically concludes the first episode on software architecture in our series. To give a small outlook, we'll probably discuss some architectural patterns in subsequent episodes. We'll look at the quality attributes architectures should realize. We'll look at how to document architectures, and also at how to scale the architectural process up to larger projects and bigger team sizes. And then of course we'll have episodes on product lines and all that stuff, but that's a separate topic. It's not going to be under the name of software architecture. Anything else you want to say, Michael or Alex?
Good luck with your next software design.
Yeah, that's a good one. Famous last words.
Cynical. Okay, then thanks, and see you next week, or in 10 days actually.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
This was another episode of Software Engineering Radio. The Software Engineering Radio team wants to thank Henning Pauli for providing the music, as well as Libsyn.com for hosting and bandwidth. For more information on the podcast, past episodes and feedback, go to se-radio.net.